The crystal chandelier trembled. Not from music, not from applause, from a gunshot. The bullet moved faster than sound. It crossed the entire length of the Imperial Soryu Hotel's Grand Banquet Hall, past 18 armed guards, past 200 suited men who called themselves businessmen, past the gleaming white marble floors and the silk curtains worth more than most people's homes. And it shattered the wine glass in Jae-Hyun Rhee's hand. Red wine exploded across white marble. It looked exactly like blood. Nobody moved. Not one person in that room. Not the generals masquerading as executives. Not the crime lords hidden behind diplomatic smiles. Not the bodyguards with fingers already on triggers. Dared to breathe. Because Jae-Hyun Rhee, the man they called the Serpent of Hangang, was still standing. He looked down at his hand, at the shattered crystal stem still between his fingers, at the red spreading across his white shirt cuff like a slow tide. His expression didn't change. His jaw didn't clench. His eyes didn't widen. He simply set the broken stem down on the table beside him, carefully, precisely, the way a man sets down something he no longer needs. 18 guards raised their weapons simultaneously. The targeting laser dots scattered across the ceiling, across faces, across the far wall like a constellation of red stars. And then, a small hand grabbed the sleeve of his jacket. Everyone froze again, harder this time. Because it was a child's hand. She was 7 years old, maybe 8, small enough that the top of her head barely reached his elbow. She was dressed in a housekeeper's daughter's clothes, plain dress, white socks, one shoe slightly untied. Her face was streaked with tears, her bottom lip trembling violently, her dark eyes enormous with a terror that had nothing to do with the 200 armed men staring at her. She looked up at Jae-Hyun Rhee, and in a voice that somehow carried across the entire silent hall, she said, "They're hurting my mom. Please, you're the only monster they're scared of." The room didn't just freeze. It stopped existing. For exactly 4 seconds, the most feared criminal empire in South Korea ceased to function because a 7-year-old girl said the word please to the man who hadn't heard that word directed at him sincerely in over a decade. Jae-Hyun looked down at her. His hand, just slightly, trembled. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is only getting started. And trust me, you are not ready for what happens next. 3 hours before the gunshot, Seoul was perfect. That was the word Jae-Hyun used when his driver asked how the evening looked. Not promising, not dangerous, not complicated, all of which would have been more accurate. Perfect, because perfect meant controlled. And Jae-Hyun Rhee had spent the last 11 years building a world where everything, every variable, every risk, every human being within his sphere was controlled. He was 41 years old, 6 feet tall, the kind of man who looked like he had been sculpted specifically to occupy expensive rooms. His suits were made by a single tailor in Gangnam who had been sewing for him since Jae-Hyun was 29 and who now refused all other clients. His watch cost more than the average Korean family earned in 3 years. His face was the kind of face that photographs well from every angle. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, a mouth permanently set in the expression of a man who has already calculated exactly what you're going to say before you say it. He was not the biggest man in Korea's underworld. He was the most precise. That distinction had kept him alive when bigger men had fallen. The Cheonma Syndicate, his organization, controlled 40% of Seoul's underground financial networks, 9 legitimate business fronts, and a security consultation firm that counted 3 cabinet ministers among its clients. They did not deal in drugs. Jae-Hyun had made that decision 9 years ago and enforced it with a brutality that surprised even his own men. They dealt in information, in leverage, in the quiet art of making problems disappear before they became loud. They were, by the standards of Korean organized crime, almost civilized, almost. Tonight was a truce meeting. The second one in 18 months between Cheonma and the Baekdo Alliance. The older, more traditional syndicate led by a man named Director Kwon Tae-shik, who had been in this world long enough to remember when Seoul's underworld was settled with fish guts and kitchen knives rather than offshore accounts and security consultants. Kwon was 63. He wore his age like armor. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the calm face of a grandfather at a family dinner, Right up until the moment he decided to end you, at which point the calm face remained exactly the same. That was what made him truly dangerous. He felt nothing when he destroyed people. He simply made a calculation and acted. Tonight's negotiation was about territorial overlap in Incheon's port district. Both organizations had interests there. Both were bleeding money because of it. And the rational solution was a formal agreement. Division of zones, fixed percentages, a document signed by both sides that would mean absolutely nothing legally, but would mean everything in the world that actually mattered. Jae-Hyun had attended these negotiations with the same energy he brought to everything, completely prepared, entirely calm, and zero trust in any human being in the room. His second-in-command stood at his shoulder as they entered the banquet hall. Do-Yoon Choi, 36, leaned with the kind of focused intensity that Jae-Hyun had spent years mistaking for loyalty. He had recruited Do-Yoon himself 12 years ago from a small enforcement operation in Busan, had trained him, promoted him, trusted him with the architecture of Cheonma's most sensitive operations. Kwon brought 15 men, Do-Yoon said quietly as they crossed the lobby, 2 at each entrance, 4 near the kitchen access, standard formation. He's nervous, Jae-Hyun said. You're cautious. With Kwon, they're the same thing. He straightened his cuffs as they reached the banquet hall doors. Keep our people visible but non-threatening. I want him to feel like he's winning for the first hour. And the second hour? That's when the real conversation starts. He pushed through the doors. The Imperial Soryu Hotel's grand banquet hall was the kind of space that made men feel important. High ceilings with chandeliers that cost as much as small houses. Round tables with centerpieces that nobody touched. Soft lighting that made everyone look slightly more powerful than they actually were. The hotel itself occupied the top 4 floors of a building in Uido, visible from half the city, close enough to the National Assembly to be either ironic or intentional, depending on who was asking. Kwon was already seated. He rose when Jae-Hyun entered, a gesture of respect that meant nothing, and both men knew it. They shook hands across the table. You look well, Kwon said. You look exactly the same, Jae-Hyun replied, which is impressive for a man your age. Kwon smiled with his mouth. I sleep well. A clear conscience is very restful. I wouldn't know, Jae-Hyun said pleasantly, and sat down. The negotiation began. It was, for the first 40 minutes, exactly what Jae-Hyun had predicted. Kwon opened with a position aggressively favorable to Baekdo. Jae-Hyun countered with something that appeared reasonable, but concealed 3 structural advantages. Kwon's people whispered to him. Jae-Hyun's people said nothing because he had already told them everything they needed to know before they walked in. The wine was poured. Jae-Hyun lifted his glass. The chandelier trembled, and the bullet hit. Her name was Zaria Okonkwo. She was 7 years and 4 months old. She had been born in Lagos, Nigeria, and had moved to Seoul with her mother when she was 3. She spoke Korean the way children do when they learn it young, without accent, without effort, without the self-consciousness that adults carry when they speak a language that isn't theirs. She also spoke English and enough Yoruba to have a real conversation with her grandmother on video calls, which she did every Sunday evening without fail. She was, by any reasonable metric, an extraordinary child, not because she was prodigious in any academic sense, though she was sharper than most adults in her orbit recognized, but because Lena Okonkwo, her mother, had raised her with a philosophy that was equal parts love and practical terror management. Lena had grown up in a world where things went wrong without warning. She had learned early that the people who survived sudden catastrophe were not the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who had already thought about what to do before the catastrophe arrived. So she had taught Zaria a set of rules. Not rules like don't talk to strangers or look both ways before crossing the street, though those too, but deeper rules, emergency rules. Rules for when the world suddenly became a place that required a 7-year-old to make decisions that 7-year-olds should never have to make. Rule number 1, stay calm enough to think. Panic uses energy you need for surviving. Rule number 2, find the most dangerous person in the room, not the loudest, not the biggest. The most dangerous. They are usually very calm. They are usually watching everything. Find that person. Rule number 3. If everything has gone wrong, that person is your only option, because everyone else is afraid of them. And fear is the only currency that works when money and reason and kindness have all failed. Lena had told Zaria these rules the way other mothers told bedtime stories. Not to frighten her, to arm her. She had never expected Zaria to need them. Lena Okonkwo was 32 years old. She had a degree in hospitality management from a university in Lagos and had been working at the Imperial Soryu Hotel for 4 years. First as a junior housekeeper, now as a senior staff member responsible for 3 floors of premium suites. She was the kind of employee that hotels quietly relied on more than they ever publicly acknowledged. Meticulous, invisible, reliable, and completely without the leverage to demand better compensation for any of it. 2 nights ago, on a Thursday at 11:47 p.m., she had gone to retrieve a cleaning cart from the basement parking garage. She should not have been there. The cart had been misplaced by a new hire. It should have been on the service level. Someone had left it near the maintenance corridor adjacent to the B2 garage level. Lena had found the note about it during her shift briefing and added it to her mental list of things to correct before the morning shift arrived. She had taken the service elevator down. She had her phone in her hand because she had been texting her mother's caretaker about a medication schedule. She had turned the corner into the corridor, and she had seen it. She had barely understood what she was seeing in the first half second. A black car, 2 men in suits holding a third man, older, Korean, in formal clothes, against the side of the vehicle, and director Kwon Tae-shik, silver-haired and grandfather calm, pressing the barrel of a suppressed pistol to the man's temple with the same relaxed certainty that a man might press a doorbell. The sound was very quiet. The body was very still afterward. Lena did not scream. She pressed herself back against the wall. She didn't know that her phone was still recording. She had activated the camera app 3 minutes earlier to show her mother's caretaker a photo of a medication label and had not yet closed it. The phone had been recording for 40 seconds by the time Kwon looked up from the body and scanned the corridor. She did not wait to see if he had seen her. She ran. She made it to her locker. She called no one. She sat on the bench in the staff changing room for 20 minutes, shaking so hard her teeth clicked together before she was able to think clearly enough to look at her phone and understand what it had captured. The video was 47 seconds long. It showed everything. She knew immediately that this was not a thing she could simply take to the police. Not when the men holding the victim had been wearing the kind of suits that suggested they worked for the kind of people who had friends inside police departments. Not when the man with the gun was Director Kwon Tae-shik, whose name she recognized from the hotel's VIP security briefings. A man whose events required extra clearance and whose guest list was reviewed by people senior enough to make Lena's department head visibly nervous. She had made a decision that night. She would say nothing. She would do nothing. She would find a way to disappear from Seoul within the week, request a transfer, resign, anything. And she would take Zaria and her elderly mother, and they would go somewhere that Director Kwon Tae-shik had no reason to look. That plan lasted 36 hours, because Director Kwon's people were better at finding witnesses than Lena was at hiding. Tonight, while the truce negotiation proceeded on the banquet floor, 5 levels above, Lena Okonkwo was in a basement utility room on level B1, zip-tied to a metal chair. Ashuri being asked very directly to produce the phone that contained the video, she had somehow still managed not to surrender. She didn't have the phone on her. She had given it to Zaria. She had told Zaria, "Go upstairs. Find the most dangerous man in the room. Give him the phone. Tell him what happened." She had not told Zaria that the most dangerous man in the room would be Jae-Hyun Rhee. She had not told Zaria that Jae-Hyun Rhee was not the kind of man who saved people. She had simply trusted her daughter and her daughter's rules and the desperate arithmetic of a mother who had run out of every other option. Zaria had taken the phone. She had tucked it into the waistband of her dress under the fabric. She had taken the service stairs because the elevators had security cameras, and the man who had grabbed her mother had been watching them. She had gone up 5 flights in near darkness, counting her breathing the way her mother had taught her, keeping the panic below the surface where it wouldn't interfere with thinking. She had pushed open the door to the banquet hall service corridor. She had looked through the small window in the door at 200 people in expensive clothes and 18 guards with weapons and a room so grand it barely seemed real. She had scanned every face, and she had found him immediately. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his title. See, she knew what her mother had taught her. Find the most dangerous one. Find the one who is watching everything and reacting to nothing. Find the one that all the other dangerous people are angled toward. The way flowers turn toward the sun, not out of admiration, but out of instinctive biological awareness. There was only one person in that room who matched the description. He was standing near the center table, holding a wine glass, and the entire room was constantly aware of exactly where he was. Zaria pushed open the service door. She walked across the banquet hall floor. Nobody stopped her immediately because nobody could process what they were seeing fast enough to act. A child alone, crossing a secured criminal negotiation in a hotel that should have been impenetrable. She reached him just as someone fired a shot. She grabbed his sleeve. She looked up at him, and she said, "They're hurting my mom. Please, you're the only monster they're scared of." The silence in the banquet hall lasted 4 seconds. Then Director Kwon set down his own glass, folded his hands on the table, and said with the gentleness of a man discussing a minor scheduling conflict, "This is unfortunate." Jae-Hyun did not look at him. He was still looking at the girl. Zaria had not looked away from his face. She was still holding his sleeve with both hands now. Tears were drying on her cheeks. She had cried them out somewhere on the staircase and had nothing left. So her face was simply wet and very, very serious. "What's your name?" Jae-Hyun asked. "Zaria." Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "My mom is Lena. She works here. They took her to the basement." "Who took her?" "The old man who was at the table with you." She didn't point. She was too smart to point. "He has gray hair and he smiles like a grandfather. My mom said he's the one who did it." From across the table, Kwon spoke again. His voice was still perfectly, chillingly calm. "To Jae-Hyun, this is a private matter. The woman witnessed something she wasn't meant to witness. We are resolving it quietly. I'd strongly advise you not to involve yourself." "She has a child," Jae-Hyun said. "Many people have children. Her child is standing in front of me." "That," Kwon said, "is a logistical error that will be corrected." Something moved in Jae-Hyun's jaw. Just a flicker. Just the smallest possible tightening of a muscle that he had spent 7 years training to stay still. Do-Hyun stepped close and spoke quietly near his ear. "Boss, the treaty. If we break this now, Baekdo has enough leverage in Incheon to cost us 300 million over the next 18 months. We lose port access. We lose the supply chain agreements. We have been building toward this negotiation for..." "I know what we've been building toward." "Then you know we can't..." "I know what we can't do. I heard you." He looked at the girl again. Zaria was watching him with the particular, one piercing concentration of a child who has been told to find the most dangerous man in the room and trust him with her mother's life. She was not begging anymore. She had said what she came to say. Now she was simply watching his face, reading it the way her mother had taught her to read faces, not for what people showed, but for what they tried to hide. She saw something in his eyes that she could not name yet, like something that looked like a door that had been locked for a very long time with the key still in it. "Can you take me to where they're keeping her?" Jae-Hyun asked. "Yes," Zaria said. He straightened to his full height. He adjusted his cufflinks, left, then right. The small ritual that his men had learned over years was not vanity, but preparation, the settling of a mind before it committed to something irreversible. Then he looked at Director Kwon across the table. "Break it," he said. Kwon's grandfather's smile disappeared for the first time all evening. "I'm sorry?" "The treaty, the negotiation, the entire arrangement." He buttoned the top button of his jacket. "Break it. You understand what you're doing. Completely." "Jae-Hyun." For the first time, something cold and genuine entered Kwon's voice. "If you walk away from this table for that woman, I will burn everything you've built, every arrangement, every agreement, or I will make the next 5 years of your life a war you cannot win." Jae-Hyun looked at him for a long moment. "You burned something of mine 7 years ago," he said quietly. "I've been patient. Tonight you made a child walk across a room full of armed men to ask a monster for help." He reached down and gently took Zaria's hand. "That was a mistake." He walked toward the service corridor. 18 guards raised weapons on both sides. Nobody fired, because firing meant killing Jae-Hyun Rhee, and nobody in that room, not even Kwan's most loyal men, was entirely certain that Jae-Hyun Rhee could actually be killed by a bullet. That was the power of myth. It stopped bullets before they were fired. Zaria's hand was very small in his. She walked beside him without hesitation, matching his pace, her untied shoelace clicking quietly against the marble floor. Do-Hyun watched them go. His face showed nothing. But inside, behind the stillness he had been trained to maintain, something was turning over, something cold and sharp and dangerous. The basement of the Imperial Soryu Hotel smelled like oil and bleach, and the particular cold that lives in spaces that never see sunlight. Zaria led him without hesitation, down the service stairs, through a corridor of exposed pipes and humming ventilation units, around a corner where the fluorescent lighting flickered on a 3-second cycle that gave everything the quality of a nightmare half-remembered. He heard Lena before he saw her, not a scream. Lena Okonkwo was not screaming, but the sound of a voice refusing to break, that particular, tightly controlled silence that costs a person everything to maintain, carried through the door of the utility room like a frequency that bypassed the ears entirely and went straight to somewhere older and more animal. Jae-Hyun stopped at the door. "Stay here," he told Zaria. "She's my mom." "I know." He crouched to her eye level. "I'm going to bring her out. But I need you to stay here so I can focus on the 4 men in that room without worrying about you. Can you do that?" Zaria looked at him. "Are you going to hurt them?" He held her gaze. "Yes." She considered this for exactly 2 seconds. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." He stood. He opened the door. 4 men, positioned exactly where experience told him they would be. 2 near the chair where Lena was zip-tied, 1 near the back wall, 1 at the far corner. All armed. All looking at the door when it opened, because that was the only place threat could reasonably come from. They were not prepared for what came through it. What happened next lasted 18 seconds. Jae-Hyun did not fight the way movie villains fight, with speeches and theatrical pauses and choreographed elegance that exists only in fiction. He fought the way a man fights who has done this many times, in many rooms, and has long since stopped finding anything in it to enjoy. He moved. The fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside the door came off its bracket in his left hand before the first man had fully raised his weapon. He discharged it directly into the faces of the 2 men nearest the door. White chemical fog. Both men staggered back, eyes useless, guns swinging wild. He closed the distance to the 3rd man, the one near the back wall, in 2 steps, elbow to throat, not a full-force strike. He calculated the exact amount of pressure needed to incapacitate without killing, which was harder than killing and required a precision that most people in this business never bothered to develop. The man folded. The 4th man had his weapon up and fired. The shot hit the metal pipe running along the ceiling. The ricochet sang off 2 walls. Jae-Hyun was no longer where he had been. He had moved the moment the man's trigger finger began to tighten. He had read the tell, in the particular way the shoulder drops a fraction of a second before the shot, and the bullet found nothing but air. He picked up a length of metal chain from the floor near the maintenance equipment. It connected with the 4th man's gun arm with enough force to snap the wrist. The gun dropped. 16 seconds. He turned to the first 2 men. Still disoriented from the extinguisher, he dealt with them quickly, efficiently. 18 seconds. He was breathing slightly harder when he turned to Lena. She was looking at him with the eyes of a woman who has been terrified for many hours and has now arrived somewhere beyond terror. A flat, clear, analytical state that looks from the outside like calm, but is actually the mind doing what it must when the body has no more adrenaline to produce. "You're real," she said. "I'm real." He was already cutting the zip ties with a folding knife from his jacket. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She tested her hands. "Yes. My daughter..." "She's outside the door." Lena closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Thank God." "She found me," Jae-Hyun said. "She was very calm. I taught her." Lena stood. Her legs were unsteady and she gripped the back of the chair for a moment before letting go. "She found the most dangerous man in the room?" He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened. Like a window in a sealed room. "Hey, that's what you told her to do?" "That's what I told her to do." He nodded once. Then, "There are 12 armed men coming down from the banquet hall right now. We need to move." They moved. Zaria was exactly where he had left her. She saw her mother and made a sound that had no words in it. Pure, concentrated relief. The sound of a child's entire nervous system releasing 7 hours of held terror at once. She ran. Lena caught her and held her with the particular ferocity of a mother who has spent hours calculating whether she would ever be able to do this again. Jae-Hyun gave them 4 seconds. "We go now," he said. Lena nodded over Zaria's head. She held her daughter's hand, and the 3 of them moved toward the emergency stairwell. They came out of the stairwell into the lobby at the wrong moment. 12 Baekdo gunmen were already there. Not 12. 14, Jae-Hyun corrected automatically as he scanned the room in the first half-second. 2 had come in from the side entrance he hadn't accounted for. The lobby of the Imperial Soryu Hotel had a ceiling that arched 30 feet overhead and walls lined with decorative columns that served no structural purpose but made excellent cover. The main desk staff had already vanished. 2 hotel guests were frozen near the elevator bank, pressed against the wall, too frightened to move. Jae-Hyun assessed everything in under a second. Options, 3 exits, 1 viable. Cover, 4 columns within reach, adequate for 2 people, inadequate for 3. Weapons, none on him. "Stay behind me," he told Lena. "There are too many." "Stay behind me." He moved. What he did in the next 90 seconds was not strategy. It was pure practice chaos. The art of making a room too complicated for 14 people with guns to coordinate effectively in. He moved between columns. He used the 2 frozen hotel guests as inadvertent cover, not putting them in danger, but moving through spaces where his enemies couldn't fire without risking hitting them. He reached one of Kwan's men and stripped the weapon before the man could recalibrate. He fired twice. Warning shots, high into the ceiling. Chunks of plaster fell. 2 men ducked. He moved again. The bullet that hit him came from the left. A shooter angled behind the concierge desk. It caught him in the shoulder. He staggered, caught himself against a column, and registered the hit with the detached clinical awareness of a man who has been shot before and knows the immediate protocol. Assess severity, maintain function, deal with the pain later. It wasn't catastrophic. It was, objectively, very bad. He kept moving. He put himself between Zaria and the main group of shooters. He didn't make a production of it. He simply positioned his body where it needed to be, the way a wall positions itself between a room and the weather. Zaria pressed against her mother behind the column, looked at him, and saw the blood spreading through the back of his jacket. She said nothing, but her eyes tracked it. They reached the side exit. Jae-Hyun had memorized the hotel layout before every visit. Habit, protocol, the thing that kept men in his position alive past 30. The side exit opened onto a service alley that connected to a parking structure 3 levels underground. His car was there. His driver was there, because his driver had been told years ago that if shooting started, the car waited 45 minutes before leaving without him. They made it to the car. Jae-Hyun got in the front seat. He leaned his head back against the headrest for exactly 3 seconds. He allowed himself that. Then, Mapo District, the secondary address. The driver didn't ask questions. In the back seat, Zaria was sitting very close to her mother. She was holding Lena's arm with both hands. She was not crying. She was watching Jae-Hyun's shoulder through the gap in the headrest with the focused attention of a child who has decided that this man is now her responsibility. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know. A lot. I know. My mom can help. Well, she knows first aid." Jae-Hyun didn't respond immediately. Then, without turning around, "I know she can. We'll be there in 12 minutes. Zaria considered this. Then very quietly, "Thank you for coming." He didn't answer, but his hand, resting on the door panel, stopped trembling. This story is just getting started. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens in that safe house changes everything. The apartment in Mapo District was not a safe house in any dramatic sense. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a building so ordinary it achieved a kind of perfect invisibility. The kind of building people drove past 1,000 times without ever registering its existence. The rent was paid from a shell account. The registration was in a name that had been dead for 6 years. The elderly woman inside, Mrs. On, one who had worked for Jae-Hyun's family before the family had ceased to exist as a concept, made tea without being asked and looked at the blood on Jae-Hyun's jacket with the mild exasperation of someone who had been dealing with this specific situation for many years. "Sit," she told him. He sat. Lena had already assessed the wound with the quick, incompetent hands of someone who had taken a wilderness first aid course 3 years ago and retained it with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. "The bullet went through," she said. "Clean exit. You need stitching. Mrs. On has a kit." "I know where the kit is," Mrs. On said from the kitchen. "I have always known where the kit is." Zaria sat in the chair across from Jae-Hyun and watched. She had been given tea and a bowl of rice crackers, which she held in her lap without eating. Her shoes were finally both tied. Mrs. On had tied them without comment upon arrival, which had made Zaria look up at the old woman with an expression of complicated gratitude. The stitching took 20 minutes. Jae-Hyun sat through it without anesthetic. The kit had none, and without making a sound. Not because he was performing stoicism for an audience, but because noise required energy, and energy was currently allocated elsewhere. When it was done, he sat back. And the apartment was quiet in the particular way that exhausted spaces become quiet after crisis. Not peaceful exactly, but hollowed out. Everyone in the room was running on reserves. Lena sat across from him. Her wrists were bruised from the zip ties. She had a cut above her eyebrow that had been cleaned and closed with a butterfly bandage. She was holding a cup of tea she hadn't drunk. "Why did you help us?" she asked. Jae-Hyun looked at her for a moment. He had been asked this question by Do-Yun in different words 3 days ago. "What's your play? What's the angle?" Which was the language of their world. People did things for reasons that could be mapped and understood and accounted for. This woman was asking differently. She was asking the real question. He said, "I couldn't save my brother." The room absorbed this. Lena looked at him. "What happened to him?" "He died in a truce meeting 7 years ago." He turned the teacup in his hands. He had not drunk it either. Someone leaked the location of where he would be. Someone from inside. He trusted the people in the room, and one of them sold that trust to Director Kwon, and my brother died because of it. I never found out who. "I'm sorry," Lena said. He looked up. People said I'm sorry to him sometimes, as performance, as protocol, as social lubricant. She said it the way people say it when they mean it. And he recognized the difference the way you recognize the difference between a photograph of sunlight and actual sunlight. He nodded. Lena set her tea down. "I need to tell you something. About that night." He went very still. 7 years ago, she said, I was working at a private event, a banquet at the Hannam Tower venue. I was junior staff. We weren't supposed to pay attention to the guests, but I was carrying a tray to the private dining room off the main hall, and the door was open. And I heard Director Kwon speaking. She stopped, started again. He was on the phone, and he said, she stopped again. "Tell me," Jae-Hyun said. His voice was very quiet. He said, "Choi confirmed the route. We have the timing. Make it clean and make it look like crossfire." She met his eyes. I didn't know what it meant then. I was 25. I didn't know who these people were. I forgot about it because I had to forget things like that to keep working in the places I worked. But when they grabbed me tonight, sitting in that room thinking about what they were going to do, her voice steadied itself. I remembered. Jae-Hyun was completely still. Choi. Choi confirmed the route. Do-Yun Choi, his second in command, the man he had recruited, the man he had trained, the man who had stood at his shoulder tonight and counseled patience and calculation and the preservation of empire, the man who had been with him the night they received the news about Yoon Seo, who had held Jae-Hyun while he wept, which Jae-Hyun had done once and only once, and had spent 7 years making sure nobody remembered. "My phone," he said. His voice came from somewhere very flat and very deep. Lena reached into Zaria's waistband. Zaria lifted her arms cooperatively and produced the phone. She handed it to him. He watched the video. 47 seconds. He watched it twice. At the 19-second mark, there was a reflection in the window of the black car, barely visible, where the angle was imperfect. But Jae-Hyun had spent 11 years training himself to see things in exactly this kind of peripheral, imperfect way. The man standing beside Kwon, lean, focused, 36 years old, Do-Yoon Choi. He set the phone down on the table. He pressed both hands flat on the surface. He breathed. Zaria was watching him. She had seen his face change when he watched the video. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in films with tears or shouting or the theatrical collapse of composure. His face had changed the way a building changes when you pull out one load-bearing support. Everything's still standing. Everything rearranged. She said, "Is it bad?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Is it fixable?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." Zaria thought about this. "My mom says most things are fixable if you know what broke them." Jae-Hyun looked at Lena. Lena looked back at him. "Your daughter," he said, "is remarkable." "I know," Lena said. "It's terrifying." He did not have to wait long. At 2:14 a.m., the apartment door came off its hinges. Not from a single impact, from a controlled breach executed by 4 men who had done this before. They came through the door and the window simultaneously, which told Jae-Hyun everything he needed to know about who had sent them. Someone who knew that Jae-Hyun Rhee would always instinctively move toward exits, and so you covered exits first. Only one person in the world knew that about him. Jae-Hyun had Zaria behind the kitchen counter before the glass finished falling. He had positioned Lena against the interior wall before the first man was fully through the door. Then Do-Yoon walked in. He was dressed the same as he had been at the banquet. He had straightened his tie. He looked like a man who had come to have a difficult but necessary conversation, which Jae-Hyun supposed was accurate. "You found it in the video," Do-Yoon said. It wasn't a question. Yes. "I wondered if you would. I didn't know she'd captured that angle." He glanced toward where Lena was standing. "She's been very inconvenient." "You sent the bullet tonight," Jae-Hyun said. "Not Kwon." Do-Yoon looked faintly impressed. "What gave it away?" "The angle. A Baekdo shooter would have aimed center mass. That shot was designed to miss, to destabilize, to give Kwon the chaos he needed to make a move at the table." He paused. "You wanted the treaty broken on their terms, not ours. I wanted it broken so Baekdo could take Inshin and we could walk away." Do-Yoon's voice was entirely reasonable, the voice of a man explaining a business strategy. "The port is a liability. The Inshin operation is bleeding us every quarter. I've been telling you this for 2 years. You've been telling me to be patient. I've been telling you what you needed to hear to function." Something shifted in Do-Yoon's voice, the first real note of something unscripted. "You've been running this organization on guilt since Jun Seo died. Every decision filtered through the question of what he would have thought. Every alliance evaluated against the memory of a man who died because he was too soft for this world." He paused. "I tried to fix that. I tried to force you forward. By leaking his location to Kwon." The words landed in the room like something physical. Do-Yoon didn't flinch. He was going to fracture the organization. He wanted to go clean within 3 years. In 3 years, we would have had no leverage, no protection, no ability to compete with anyone who decided to move against us. He was going to get us all killed with his idealism. I made a strategic decision. "He was 26 years old," Jae-Hyun said. "He was my brother." "I know." For the first time, something genuine moved across Do-Yoon's face. Not guilt. Something more complicated than guilt. "I know what he was to you. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to understand it." "I understand it completely," Jae-Hyun said. And then he attacked. What happened in the next 2 minutes was not the controlled, calculated precision of the basement. It was something older and less managed. The collision of 12 years of proximity and trust, and the specific, searing grief of betrayal by someone you had chosen to believe in. So Jae-Hyun fought with everything the basement fight had not used. Not economy of motion, but ferocity. Not calculation, but the cold fury of a man who has just had 7 years of unanswered guilt answered in the worst possible way. Do-Yoon was good. He had been trained by Jae-Hyun, which meant he had been trained by one of the best, and he used everything he had been taught. He was younger and unwounded. He got a knife in. Jae-Hyun took it in the side. Not deep, not fatal, but real, and staggered back against the wall. Do-hyun stepped back. His 4 men raised their weapons. Jae-Hyun was bleeding from the shoulder and the side. He was breathing hard. He was standing. "You should have stayed out of it tonight," Do-hyun said. He sounded almost sorry. "The girl, the woman, it was almost resolved. You walked away from 300 million and everything we built for." He stopped. "For what?" Jae-Hyun asked. "Goodness, for a child who grabbed your sleeve." "Yes," Jae-Hyun said. "Exactly." Do-hyun looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Something he closed down before it could become anything nameable. "Come to Hangang Bridge," he said. 2 hours, bring the phone. Kwon wants the footage directly. You give it to him. We all walk away from tonight with our lives. He straightened his jacket. "Kwon has the girl." Jae-Hyun went completely still. "He took her from the kitchen while we were..." Do-hyun gestured at the apartment. "He has people everywhere, Jae-Hyun. He's been 3 steps ahead since the banquet. Come to the bridge alone. Trade the footage. It ends tonight." He walked out with his men. Lena came out from behind the wall. Her face was the color of ice. "Zaria," she said. "I know." Jae-Hyun was already moving, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. "Get in the car." "Not, we're going to the bridge." "We're going to trade the footage?" He looked at her. "We're going to the bridge," he said again. Lena understood the distinction. She nodded. Hangang Bridge at 4 a.m. looked like the end of the world imagined by someone with a talent for atmosphere. The river was black and enormous beneath the steel span. The city lights reflected in it without warming it. Cold gold on cold black, Seoul's glow turned hollow and distant by the water. The wind came off the Han River the way it always did in early autumn. Specific, purposeful, carrying the smell of the city and something older than both. Director Kwon Tae-shik stood at the center of the bridge. He had Zaria. She was standing beside him, his hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just resting, like a grandfather, like a man who had done nothing wrong and had nothing to fear and was simply waiting for a conversation to conclude. Zaria was looking toward the end of the bridge, waiting. Jae-Hyun came alone as instructed. He walked from the south end of the bridge slowly, not from fear, but from the 2 wounds being held together by will and pressure and Mrs.On's stitching. He had left Lena at the car at the bridge entrance. She had not argued. She had looked at his face and understood, as she was beginning to understand many things about this man, that there was a plan operating beneath the surface of every instruction he gave. Kwon watched him approach. "You look terrible," and Kwon said, even when Jae-Hyun was close enough. "You look exactly the same as you always have," Jae-Hyun said. "Which is the problem?" Kwon almost smiled. "The footage. First the girl. You're not in a position to establish conditions. I'm the only person on this bridge who has the footage," Jae-Hyun said. "So I'm in precisely that position." Kwon considered. He removed his hand from Zaria's shoulder and said pleasantly, "Go stand over there, little one." Zaria walked forward. She walked past the midpoint of the bridge toward Jae-Hyun. When she reached him, she stopped. She looked up at him. In the dark, with the river below and the city glowing around them, and a murderer 15 feet away, she looked at his face with the same unafraid directness she had brought to the banquet hall. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Not particularly," he said honestly. "Okay." She moved to stand slightly behind him and to the left, exactly where he had positioned her in the basement before entering the utility room. She had understood then that this was where he needed her to be, and she had gone there. She understood it again now. He faced Kwon. "The footage exists in 3 places," Jae-Hyun said. "The phone, a cloud backup, and a secure server that will automatically transmit to 6 journalists and 2 prosecutors at 6 a.m. unless canceled by a specific code." He paused. "I set the backup and the server transfer while Do-hyun's men were breaching the apartment. I had about 40 seconds. It was enough." Kwon's expression didn't change. "You're bluffing." "You've known me for 14 years, Jae-Hyun said. "In 14 years, have I ever bluffed?" A pause. The river moved below them. "What do you want?" Kwon asked. And for the first time, underneath the perfect grandfather calm, something shifted, something that recognized the shape of being cornered. "I want to tell you something first," Jae-Hyun said. "About Jun Seo." Kwon waited. He was going to change things, not just the organization, the city. He wanted legitimate business. He had contacts in the National Assembly. He had a plan that would have genuinely, materially improved the lives of people who had nothing to do with anything we were involved in. He spoke slowly, without anger, the way you speak when you have been holding something for 7 years and are finally, very carefully, setting it down. Do-Yun killed him because he was afraid of that. Because a clean empire was an empire with no leverage over the people running it, and you provided the moment. You pulled the trigger. Kwon looked at him. I had a brother once too, he said. He chose loyalty over ambition. He never became anything. He died ordinary. He paused. I chose differently. Yes, Jae-Hyun said. You did. The moment you chose that girl in the banquet hall, Kwon said, you lost. You know that. Mercy is an exit wound. Everything you built bleeds out through it. Maybe, Jae-Hyun said, but I'm still standing here. For now, Kwon said, and he raised the gun he had kept at his side. At exactly that moment, Lena Okonkwo came from behind the concrete support pillar of the bridge's midspan. She had not stayed at the car. She had gone around. She had taken the maintenance walkway along the bridge's understructure, narrow, unlighted, 40 feet above the river, and had come up through the maintenance hatch on the far side of the pillar, 20 feet behind Kwon. She was a hotel housekeeper. She knew the maintenance structures of buildings the way doctors know anatomy. Practically, specifically, when without sentiment. She had a tire iron. She swung. The metal connected with Kwon's gun arm at the wrist. The gun fired. The shot went skyward, into nothing, into the dark above Seoul. Kwon turned, already reaching for a secondary weapon with his other hand. From the north end of the bridge, Do-Yun arrived. He came alone, no men, just himself, walking at the same measured pace he brought to everything, watching the scene with the focused attention of a man who is still calculating. He saw Kwon raising the secondary weapon toward Lena. He saw Jae-Hyun moving toward Zaria, shielding her the same way he had shielded her in the hotel lobby, body between the girl and the threat, without calculation, without cost-benefit analysis, without any of the architecture of thought that governed everything else he did. Do-Yun had built his entire philosophy of this world on the idea that compassion was structural weakness. That the moment you let something matter more than the organization died. That his own clarity, his willingness to make decisions others were too soft to make, was what had kept Cheonma functional for 12 years. He had believed this completely. He raised his weapon. He aimed at Jae-Hyun. He held the aim for 3 seconds, and then he moved it 6 inches to the left. He shot director Kwon Tae-shik. Kwon staggered back against the bridge railing. He looked at Do-Yun with an expression that was, for the first and last time, entirely unmasked. Pure, genuine shock. Then the railing gave way. Old steel, stressed metal, the specific frailty of infrastructure maintained by institutions that don't know they need it. And he fell. The river received him without drama. The sound was very brief. Then silence. Do-Yun lowered his weapon. Sirens were rising from somewhere in the city below. Someone had reported the gunshot. Oh, they had perhaps 4 minutes. Jae-Hyun looked at Do-Yun. Do-Yun looked back. Fear built you, Do-Yun said. His voice was different from any voice he had used in the apartment. Quieter, stripped of everything strategic. I still believe that. Fear was the foundation. He looked at Zaria, tucked behind Jae-Hyun's arm, watching him with enormous dark eyes. But she walked across a room full of armed men because she thought you could save her mother. Not because she was afraid of you, not because she believed something about you that you stopped believing about yourself. He paused. I'm not sure when that happened, but it changed the calculation. Jae-Hyun said nothing. Go, Do-Yun said. Take them and go. The footage transmits at 6 a.m. regardless. You need to be clear of Seoul by then. The syndicate, I'll manage the transition. It's what I do. Something that might have been the shadow of a very old grief moved across his face. It's the only thing I do well. He turned. He walked back toward the north end of the bridge. He did not look back. The sirens grew louder. Jae-Hyun took Zaria's hand. Lena was beside him, the tire iron still in her hand, her face entirely calm in the way that people are calm when they have moved past the point where calm is a choice and it has become the only mode available. They walked south. Behind them, the city of Seoul began its slow rotation toward morning. The footage transmitted at 6:03 a.m. By 7 a.m., 3 major Korean news organizations had confirmed receipt. By 9 a.m., a special prosecutor's office had issued a statement. By noon, 21 members of the Baekdo Alliance had been taken into custody. Director Kwon Tae-shik's body was recovered from the Han River at 8:17 a.m. The cause of death was recorded as a single gunshot wound. The investigation into the shooter was ongoing, and even in the specific way that investigations into certain kinds of deaths are ongoing, would remain so indefinitely. Do-Yoon Choi disappeared from Seoul on the same morning. No warrant was issued for him. The footage showed Kwon, not Do-Yoon, and Lena, when interviewed through the anonymous intermediary that Jae-Hyun's lawyers arranged, could not identify anyone else at the scene in the parking garage. Whether this was because she genuinely hadn't seen Do-Yoon clearly in the reflection, or because she had made a different decision about what to remember, she did not say. The Cheoma syndicate fractured without Jae-Hyun's authority holding it together. Some components were absorbed by competitors, some dissolved entirely. The legitimate business fronts continued operating, managed now by people who had always preferred not to ask too many questions about ownership structures. Where Jae-Hyun cooperated with the special prosecutor's office through arrangements so carefully constructed that his own role remained almost entirely invisible. He gave them what they needed to dismantle Baekdo's financial network. He gave them names that would close 3 cold cases the prosecutor's office had been unable to crack for years. He gave them everything, and then he had nothing left to give. That was the part nobody had prepared him for. Not the legal exposure. Not the financial loss. And it was substantial, the kind of number that would have meant something to him 6 weeks ago, and now arrived in documents his lawyer slid across a table and felt like information about a stranger. Not even the safety calculations, the new address, the changed routines, the weeks of operating without the 18-layer security infrastructure that had surrounded him so long, he had stopped noticing it was there. The part nobody had prepared him for was the silence. So not external silence. The apartment in Mapo was quiet, yes, but the silence he couldn't account for was internal. The place where the machinery of empire had been running for 11 years, constant and consuming and loud in a way he had never registered as loud because it was all he had known. Now it was gone, and in the space where it had been, there was nothing yet. Not peace, not relief, not the clean, cinematic sense of a man who has shed a burden and stands lighter for it. Just absence. When the particular, disorienting absence of a man who has spent 11 years being the serpent of Hangang and now needs to figure out who exists when that name is removed. He didn't know. That was the honest answer. And he was not accustomed to honest answers about himself. He had not looked in a mirror properly since the bridge. This had started without intention. The first morning, his shoulder was being redressed, and he had stood at the bathroom sink and looked at the mirror, and the man looking back at him had been so unfamiliar that he had simply turned away. Not from vanity, not from self-disgust, from something stranger and harder to name, the sense that the face in the mirror was waiting for a title that no longer applied. The way a deposed king's portrait still wears the crown even after the kingdom is gone. He avoided the mirror after that. He told himself it was practical. The wound dressing was manageable without it. 3 weeks passed. His hands still shook sometimes. Not constantly, and never when anyone was watching, because the training that had built him was still operational, even when everything built on top of it had been stripped away. But in the early mornings before the day fully arrived, when he sat at the kitchen table with tea going cold in front of him and the city outside doing its ordinary things, his right hand, just slightly, just briefly, trembled. He had told himself for the first week that it was the wounds, blood loss, healing tissue, a physical explanation for a physical symptom. By the second week, he had stopped telling himself that. He didn't know what it was. That was the closest thing to truth he could manage. He did not know what his hands were doing when they shook, or what they were trying to communicate, or whether the trembling was grief or fear, or simply the body's honest report on what it costs to be rebuilt from the inside out at 41 years old. He sat with it. That was all he could do. He had spent 11 years being a man who acted on every problem, who converted every uncertainty into a plan, who treated the gap between diagnosis and solution as something to be closed as efficiently as possible. He was learning, and slowly, badly, without any particular grace, that some things could not be closed. They could only be sat with, in the early morning, with cold tea, while the city moved outside and the hand on the table did what it needed to do. Lena brought him food sometimes, not out of obligation. He had made clear through a lawyer in a separate arrangement that material provision was handled for both her and Zaria for as long as they needed it, independent of anything else. She brought food because she was Lena Okonkwo, and Lena Okonkwo had been feeding people around her since she was 12 years old in Lagos, and her mother worked double shifts. It was the language she used when words weren't enough and silence wasn't right. She didn't ask him how he was doing. He was grateful for that. She asked him once, when Zaria was asleep and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the city quiet outside, "Do you miss it?" He was quiet for a long time. "Hey, I miss knowing who I was," he said. She looked at him steadily. "That's not the same as missing the empire." "No," he said. "It's worse." She nodded. She didn't offer a solution or a comfort or the kind of reassurance people offer when they want to close a painful conversation. She just nodded. The way you nod when someone says something true and you have enough respect for them not to try to make it untrue. He found that he was grateful for that too. 3 weeks after the bridge. The morning was cold in the way that October mornings in Seoul are cold, specific and clean, the kind of cold that clarifies everything it touches. The sky above the Han River was the particular shade of gray-blue that exists only in the 20 minutes before sunrise fully arrives, when the light is present but hasn't yet committed to a color. Jae-Hyun walked along the Hangang riverside path. His shoulder was healing. The wound in his side was healing. Well, he moved carefully, but the pain had settled into something manageable. A background note rather than a constant interruption. He was learning to distinguish between the two, which was, his doctor had told him, progress. He didn't feel like progress. He felt like a man walking in the cold at 5 a.m. because the apartment had become, in the hours between 3 and 6, a place where the silence was loud in a way that sleep couldn't survive. Zaria was beside him. She had appeared at his door at 4:47 a.m., dressed in her coat and boots and holding 2 paper cups of instant cocoa from the convenience store 2 blocks away, which she had apparently purchased with the emergency money Lena kept in the kitchen drawer. Without telling Lena she was doing so, she had held out a cup. He had looked at her for a moment. Then he had put on his coat. They had been walking for 20 minutes. The river moved beside them, black and enormous and indifferent, doing what rivers do regardless of what the people walking alongside them are working through. Occasionally, Zaria drank from her cup. Occasionally, he drank from his. Neither of them spoke, which was a particular quality of Zaria's presence that he had noticed and not yet been able to account for. She seemed to understand, in a way most adults did not, that silence was not a problem to be solved. He was thinking about Yoon Seo. He had been thinking about Yoon Seo a lot recently, in which was different from the thinking he had done for 7 years. For 7 years, thinking about Yoon Seo had been an exercise in guilt maintenance, a controlled, purposeful rehearsal of grief that he had used to fuel the cold engine of the syndicate. It had kept him in motion when motion was the only alternative to being still with the loss. It had been, he now understood, a way of keeping Yoon Seo's death useful, functional, a source of directed energy rather than just a hole in the world. Now, without the engine to feed, the grief had changed shape. It was less controlled. It arrived in different places, not at the negotiating table or in the planning room, but here, at 5 a.m., beside a river, with cold air in his lungs and a paper cup of instant cocoa going cold in his hand. It arrived like something that had been waiting at the door for 11 years and had finally been let in and was now simply present, large and shapeless and not particularly interested in being useful. He didn't know what to do with it. He was learning slowly that maybe that was the point, that grief wasn't supposed to do anything, that it was simply what love looked like when the person was gone. Zaria stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She was looking at the river, her cup held in both hands, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. As he had learned that Zaria's questions required this. She didn't ask anything she hadn't already thought about, and the pause before the question was the last part of the thinking, not a rhetorical gesture. "Before me," she said. "Before my mom. Were you happy?" The question landed somewhere very deep and very still. He turned it over. He applied to it the same honesty he had been slowly, painfully learning to apply to himself in the early morning hours when the silence was loud and the hand on the table did what it needed to do. He thought about the empire, the control, the myth, the specific satisfaction of a problem anticipated and solved before it became dangerous. The quiet authority of being the most feared person in every room he entered. The years of motion and precision and the cold, the functional purposefulness of a man who had converted grief into an engine and run the engine for 11 years without stopping. He thought about whether any of that had been happiness. "No," he said. Zaria looked up at him. "Then what were you?" He looked at the river. His right hand, holding the paper cup, trembled, just slightly, just briefly, the way it did in the early mornings. He didn't hide it. He didn't have an answer. And that was the truth of it. And the truth landed in him with the weight of something that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. He had not been happy. He had not been whole. He had been functional, extraordinarily, ruthlessly, efficiently functional. And he had mistaken function for identity for so long that now, without the function, he genuinely did not know what was underneath. He was 41 years old. He was starting from somewhere very close to zero. He didn't know who he was without the fear attached to him. That was the answer he couldn't give her, because it was the answer that frightened him more than anything in the banquet hall, or the basement, or the bridge had frightened him. Not knowing. Standing in the open. No armor, no myth. No 18 layers of security and reputation, and the cold certainty of being unkillable. Just a man with a shaking hand and a paper cup of cold cocoa, and a 7-year-old asking him the only question that actually mattered. "I don't know," he said. Zaria looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and took his trembling hand in hers. Not to stop it, not to fix it, just to hold it, the way she had held his sleeve in the banquet hall. Small and certain and completely unafraid of whatever she found on the other side. "Okay," she said. As she said it the way she said most things, matter-of-factly without drama, like a person who has decided that not knowing is an acceptable starting point and who is prepared to stand in it with you while you figure out the rest. They stood there. The river moved. The light came, slowly, the way real things change, without announcement, without the clean, cinematic arrival of a sunrise in a story with a tidy ending. It came gray first, then a thin line of pale gold along the eastern edge of the city. Then more, spreading across the water, touching the bridge structures and the apartment buildings, and the cold, ordinary surface of Seoul, going about the business of a morning that did not know and did not care about the man standing at its edge, trying to learn who he was when everything that had defined him was gone. Jae-Hyun's hand trembled. Zaria held it. He did not become something new in that moment. He did not find the answer to the question she had asked. The grief for Jun Seo did not resolve itself into something useful or directed or clean. The mirror in the apartment was still something he walked past without looking. The silence in the early hours was still loud. He was not fixed. He was not finished. He was standing in the open with a child's hand in his and a question he couldn't answer. And the first real light of a morning he had not been certain. 3 weeks ago. Who were that he would live to see? He looked at the water. For the first time in 11 years, he did not know what came next. For the first time in 11 years, he thought that might be enough. If this ending stayed with you, if that last question from Zaria hit somewhere you didn't expect, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Stories that don't wrap up clean. Stories that stay with you at 2 a.m. Stories that ask you something on the way out. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop a comment below and tell me, at what exact moment did Jae-Hyun stop being a monster in your eyes? The basement? The lobby? The bridge? Or was it that final question on the river? I read every single one. Hit like so more people find this story, and we'll see you in the next one.